Morning, good afternoon, good evening, and thank you for watching the presentation on my paper on the direct and indirect effects of services offshoring on local labor market outcomes. I'm not saying anything new to this audience when I mention that the recent political debate has evolved around the impact the international trade has on the domestic labor force and on the aggregate welfare. A discussion that has led to the break of existing trade deals and the birth of new ones. A similar discussion has enriched also the economic literature. Questions like by how much trade improve firms' productivity and how does trade affect the labor market are questions that are filled in the literature. Most of the political debate and economic debate, however, has focused on the direct effect of the international trade in final goods and often overlook trading services and the indirect effect the international trade has on the economies. Let me spend now one slide to convince you how important are services for our economies. First of all, from a macroeconomic perspective, services account for more than 25% of the world trade. At the macro level, firms are increasingly switching towards the services production, either diversifying their production portfolio or as a complementary to their main production or to establish new comparative advantages. What is most, trade and intermediate services, which in this paper I will define as the offshoring of services, had, is, and will increase even more due to the new technologies and the globalization of the market. So the results in the literature that focus on manufacturing offshoring might not be consistent to the services case, as the two have different roles in the production process and have different trade characteristics as the different path during the Great Recession has shown. So the question of my paper is what is the impact the services offshoring has on local labor market outcomes, both directly and indirectly? At the aggregate level, I estimate the impact that services offshoring has on average employment and wages. And I found substantial increase in the two labor market outcomes by the increase in offshoring within a local labor market. Exploiting the granularity of the data that I'm using, I showed that a substantial part of the positive result is driven by spillover effect, meaning that non-offshoring firms increase their employment and wages due to the offshoring of services of the firms that are located in the same local labor market. This result is the main contribution of the paper to the literature, and is also a novelty for the literature on manufacturing offshoring. Still using the most disaggregated available data, I conduct a quantile analysis within each local labor market. And I found that firms at the top of the productivity distribution are those benefiting the most in terms of employment and wages from services offshoring. And these latest results suggest an increase in the dispersion of firms' productivity and hence in the performance within a local labor market. There are also other two results in the paper that I don't have time to present. The first one regard the workers, where I showed that there's a heterogeneous effect depending on workers' characteristic by services offshoring in terms of employment and wages, both the direct exposure to service offshoring and the indirect exposure to service offshoring. And finally, I showed that the results are sensitive on the definition of local labor market that is used. So I take as a case of study the United Kingdom, the second largest country in terms of trading services in the world. Services account for 45% of the overall export of the UK and a quarter of the overall imports. As an industry, the services employ 70% of the labor force and account for more than 80% of the overall GDP of the country. There is also another reason why I'm using the UK as a case of study, because it has very good data on services trade. I combined three data sets from the Office of National Statistics to construct a unique data set that contains a wide set of information on firms, their plans, and trading services. The data allows me to geographically locate the majority of firms' plans and trading services flow within the country. And the data on services trade are the largest available to researchers and distinguish between 52 different types of services and highlight how also firms in the manufacturing industry trade in services. Since I know the geographical location of the firms, I define as a local labor market a sector local area where the offshoring firms are located. I hence account for recent study from the empirical literature that showed that workers are relatively static in their local area and sector of employment. I construct the measure of services offshoring, aggregating firms' imports of services within sectors and local areas in each year. Given the high disaggregation of the services trade data available, I can distinguish between broad offshoring, which is the overall inputs of services, and narrow offshoring, which is the inputs of services in the same categories of firms' output. So all the services that are competing with firms' own portfolio. The data that I'm using allow me to compute this measure not only for the firms within the services industry, but also for the firms in the manufacturing industry that are producing and trading services as well. And finally, this measure allows to account for firms' heterogeneous production process as the best practice in the literature. At first, I explored the variation of employment and wages across local labor market, which are my dependent variable. As explanatory variable, other than my measure of offshoring, I include a wide set of local labor market control variables and a wide range of fixed effect. Of course, some unobservable by be affecting at the same time the dependent and independent variable. As an example, the opening of a new production plant increasing the demand of a final product, which simultaneously increases offshoring, employment, and wages. Or there might be some concerns regarding the reverse causality where larger employment and wages increases offshoring. To address any potential concern, I implement an instrumental variable strategy, instrumenting the offshoring of services with total inputs of services from selected exporting countries in selected importing countries. And the intuition is that increases in industry inputs of intermediate services in other high-income importing countries follow a path that is similar to the one in the UK. It is reasonable to assume that the expansion of the services sector in the exporting countries due to the technological changes and shift in the production process toward the service sector and not due to the increased demand for services inputs. The first set of results refer to the estimation looking at the effects of service offshoring on average employment and wages within a local labor market. Both the OLS and IV specifications show positive and statistically significant effect on employment and average wages by service offshoring. The results are the same independently, whether used as a definition, the broad offshoring or the narrow offshoring measure. Just to give you a back of the envelope computation of what is the magnitude of these results and taking as a reference the IV results, a 10% increase of services offshoring is equal to 1 percentage point of the standard deviation of the broad offshoring measure. To this 10% increase correspond roughly 10% increase in employment, which is more than 160,000 workers per year, or a quarter of the increase in overall employment in the UK in the period between 2014 and 2015. As for the average wage, there's an increase of 0.3% in the average wage to 10% increase in services offshoring, which is roughly an increase of £500 in the annual wage per worker. So the take home for this slide is that indeed services offshoring increases average wages and employment and the local labor market level. And now I move to the results exploring the heterogeneities of firms within a local labor market. The table here summarize the results at the firm level. So when I distinguish between firms that are directly involved in services offshoring and those that are not directly involved in services offshoring, but that are located in the same local labor market of the offshoring firms. For both firms in the table, highlight the impact that being exposed to services offshoring and the local labor market level has on firms' performance. For the importing firms, the offshoring measure is at the net of its own offshoring of services. Looking first at the broad offshoring, both importing and non-importing firms have significant and positive employment and wage elasticity to services offshoring. I then investigate which are the channels through which this is happening, and I decompose the offshoring flows between narrow offshoring, which is the inputs of services competing with firms' output, and input offshoring, which are the services complements to firms' main production. For non-export importers, the exposure to narrow offshoring has a negative impact, counterbalanced by the positive effects of input offshoring. So the positive overall effects of service offshoring on non-importing firms is driven by the spillover effect, which is an aggregate of imitation, supply chain, and competition spillover. The opposite is true for the importers. Positive overall effects are driven by narrow offshoring and diminished by the complementary offshoring. The last results that I want to show you is on the distributional effect of services offshoring. In the two graphs here is represented the elasticity of employment on your left and on average wages on your right to services offshoring at each quintile of the productivity distribution. Within each local labor market, at any point of the productivity distributions, firms have a comparable employment and average wage productivity elasticity. So this implies that at the firm level, firms that are at the top of the productivity distribution are benefiting in terms of employment and wages much more than the firms at the bottom of the productivity distribution in absolute term, which increases the differences across firms. To conclude, the aim of the paper is to estimate the effects of services offshoring on local labor markets. Two are the main results and the contribution of the paper to the literature. First of all, the analysis captures both the direct and the indirect effect of services offshoring on local labor market, highlighting the importance of the latter of the spillover effect in explaining the positive overall results. And second, I showed that the effects of services offshoring are not homogeneous across firms, and that indeed services offshoring contribute to increase the dispersion and the differences across firms within a local labor market. Thank you so much for your attention. Do not hesitate to get in touch if you have any comment or any question.